And you might either shake your fist at heaven, why are you doing this to me? And become bitter, or it transforms you. One of two things. You become bitter, or it transforms you. Now, in order for it to transform you, you have to not be the one that's destroyed. And you can only find this out through suffering. And he basically talks about openings are made in a life by suffering that are not made in any other way. Serious questions are raised and primary answers come forth. Insights are reached concerning aspects of life that were hidden and obscure before the assault. The startling discovery is made that if there were no suffering, there would be no freedom. No event in the life of a single person can be separated from what are, in fact, the ends of God. The answer to his suffering is to face it and challenge it to do its worst, because he knows that when it has exhausted itself, it has only touched the outer walls of his dwelling place. This can only come to pass because he has found something big enough to contain all violences and violations. He has found that his life is rooted in a God who cares for him and cultivates his spirit. And sometimes in that cultivation, you prune away the stuff that you were attached to, like it got ripped away from you. Often, as he talks about, as an assault. So one of the reasons that suffering is one of the disciplines of the Spirit is because sometimes you would not get the lesson unless it came to you in hard and heavy in that way. You would not get it. And it causes you to basically create the suffering, creates a wound deep enough so that the forces of your life rally. Okay, you cut grass, it grows back faster.
Makes sense.
I'm in a continuing war with blackberries. Not the plants, not the phenomenon.
I'm curious, what happened to Thor?
He was a student. I haven't seen him.
Was it like American History X?
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
That kind of realization.
That, possibly. I mean, not me directly necessarily, but I deal with a lot of folks that are on that side of the political spectrum. Okay, we know we don't agree politically or whatever, but we're coming together on their addiction issues, and I can help them with that, and so I could reach out through that community, see what happened with him.
I appreciate your efforts.
Yes. So, this he ends with this poem. Heir to the kingdom neath the skies, often he fails, yet fails. Often he falls, yet falls to rise. Stunned, bleeding, beaten back, holding still to the upward track, playing his part in creation's plan. God like an image, this is man. So I encourage you to read some of Howard's stuff, because basically, for example, in when he talks about the community of suffering, and I think earlier slides, not today, but a couple of weeks ago when I talked about The Luminous Darkness, which is yet another book of his, where he describes what segregation does to black people and white people in particular. So with black people, we have a community of suffering where, if you remember that graphic where I said this is the ivory tower and we live in the shadow of the ivory tower, so we create, so we create a world inside of segregation that we keep warm and protected from it, and this becomes our community inside of segregation. So just like in a ghetto, it doesn't necessarily destroy us. We can thrive within it. And so he's saying, okay, that's a response to the suffering, and it's good for us to find our own healing, but if we stay in that place and not extend that healing to the people that are causing or attempting to cause our suffering, we're doing violence. Okay, so even if they beat us, we still have to teach them. You know, so it's like that whole forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Speak it, Lauren. Anyway, so the hidden curriculum. The visible narrative of the Great Depression, which also was a basically level of suffering economically, generated great solutions, and those are often invisible. Okay, so when we're in depression economically today, some of the same solutions are available, and they have often been generated out of necessity. When your depression is emotional, that is often in the depths where you can actually find some sort of solution to. All right, so this comes out of the Justice Chess playbook. So you can look at mathematical operations like algebra, which means the mending, as either problem solving or strength building, skill building. It's a problem to be solved, or it's a skill building exercise. So think of your math problems as skill building exercises, right? So the massive failure of capitalism in the Great Depression, all right? The fiscal fecal material has been imparted as a departure vector by the rotating blades. So, given the callous indifference to suffering displayed by the stereotypical capitalist, people considered all kinds of alternatives: socialism, separation, separate black nation within a nation. There was a 49th state movement. This is before we had Alaska and Hawaii, right? The Nation of Islam was born during this time, too. Okay, where people are saying, okay, let's have a state within a state, and they were thinking of like Louisiana and Mississippi or whatever, right? Because we didn't have Alaska or Hawaii then. We're not going back to Africa because you bankrupted the Black Star Line with Marcus Garvey. What do we do? Okay, so algebra, the mending, has to take place in logical fashion. You start with the hardest thing first, and you get an answer once you work it through. So that's with economics. So the same old, for example, with the Scottsboro boys. So this is during the Depression. Now, depending on what your definition of boys is, prepubescent. Many of these gentlemen were not prepubescent. They're working men, or young men anyway. Scottsboro boys. So the term hobos, which we now generically use for homeless, came from the Depression, where they were called ho boys, i.e. migrant agricultural workers. Actually, a cowboy is also a migrant agricultural worker. Ho boys, that's where we get hobos. So hoboing was a common pastime in the Depression, year, for example, of 1931. For some, riding freight trains was an appealing adventure compared to the drudgery and dreariness of their daily lives. Others hopped rail cars to move from one fruitless job search to the next, because lots of people did not have cars then, couldn't necessarily hitchhike then, so you ride the rails. Right? 24 or so, mainly male and mainly young, whites and blacks, rode the Southern Railroad's Chattanooga to Memphis freight on March 25th, 1931. Among them were 4 black Chattanooga teenagers hoping to investigate a rumor of government jobs in Memphis, hauling logs in the river, and 5 other black teens from various parts of Georgia. 4 young whites, 2 males and 2 females, dressed in overalls, also rode the train returning to Huntsville from unsuccessful job searches in the cotton mills of Chattanooga. Soon after the train crossed the Alabama border, a white youth walked across the top of a tank car. He stepped on the hand of a black youth named Hayward Patterson, who was hanging on its side. Patterson had friends aboard the train. A stone-throwing fight erupted between white youths and a larger group of black youths. Eventually, the blacks succeeded in forcing all but one of the members of the white gang off the train. Patterson pulled the one remaining white youth, Orville Gilley, back onto the train after it had accelerated to a life-endangering speed. Some of the whites forced off the train went to the station master in Stevenson to report what they described as an assault by a gang of blacks. Station master wired ahead. Posse in Paint Rock, Alabama stopped the train. Dozens of men with guns rushed at the train as it ground to a halt. The armed men rounded up every black youth they could find. 9 captured blacks, soon to be called the Scottsboro Boys, were tied together with plow line, loaded on a flatback truck, and taken to a jail in Scottsboro. Also greeted by the posse in Paint Rock were 2 mill workers from Huntsville, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. One or the other of the girls, either in response to a question or on their own, told one of the posse members that they had been raped by a gang of 12 blacks with pistols and knives. Understand how you get armed in 1931. You generally aren't. Okay? Unless you're military or ex-military. If you're black. Because the Negro Removal National Rifle Association, basically their gun laws were trying to prevent blacks from getting guns to shoot back at the Klan back in the 19th century. So lots of blacks had access to weapons in any case. They weren't as common as they are, say, today, right? And given, when could this rape have taken place? Because there were plenty of white witnesses at any time during this particular journey. So, in the jail that March 25th, Price pointed out 6 of the 9 boys and said that they were the ones who raped her. Guards reportedly replied, if these 6 had Miss Price, it stands to reason the others had Miss Bates. Interesting logic there. One of the accused, Clarence Norris, called the girls liars. He was struck by a bayonet. This is before, of course, DNA evidence or any kind of actual rational police jurisdiction, or not jurisdiction, but practices, right? A crowd of several hundred men hoping for a good old-fashioned lynching surrounded the Scottsboro jail the night of their arrest for rape. Their plans were foiled when Alabama's governor ordered the National Guard to Scottsboro to protect the suspects, which is interesting. Trials of the Scottsboro boys began 12 days after their arrest. Mr. Patterson described the scene as one big smiling white face. Many local newspapers had made their conclusions about the defendants before the trial began. One headline read, all Negroes positively identified by girls and one white boy who was held prisoner with pistol and knives while 9 black fiends committed revolting crime. Now, given their arrest, they were arrested. Were any weapons found? No. Representing the boys in their uphill legal battle was Stephen Roddy and Milo Moody. Roddy was unpaid and unprepared Chattanooga's real estate attorney. Criminal. Okay, yeah. On the first day of trial was so stewed, that is drunk, he could hardly walk straight. Moody was a forgetful 70-year-old local attorney who hadn't tried a case in decades. This is your defense. Those of you who have experience with the criminal justice system and have met public defenders, yeah. Defense lawyers demonstrated their incompetence in many ways. They expressed a willingness to have all 9 defendants tried together, despite the prejudice such a trial might cause to Roy Wright, for example, who at age 12 was the youngest of the 9 Scottsboro boys. The prosecution, fearing that a single trial might constitute irreversible error, decided to try the defendants in groups of 2 or 3. Interesting logic there. Cross-examination of Victoria Price lasted only minutes, while examining Dr. R. Bridges and John Lynch were not cross-examined at all. Ruby Bates was not asked about contradictions between her testimony and that of Price. Eventually, after years of trial, either through paroles or escapes, all Scottsboro boys eventually found their way out of Alabama. Yay. Charles Williams was paroled in 43, Ozzie Powell and Clarence Norris in 46, and Andy Wright, the last to leave Alabama for good. He'd been paroled earlier, but then was violated. Haywood managed a dramatic escape in 48, and Norris and Patterson went on to participate in the writing of books about their lives, which are still available. So when I talked about when the fecal matter hits the rotating blades, it's basically academese for when the shit hits the fan. So meaning messy and exciting consequences brought out by a previously secret situation becoming public. So part of how you look at, in terms of Howard and suffering and like the Scottsboro boys case, you can see parallels to legal situations today. So one of the things that you can do in terms of if there is a persistent practice like profiling or other things, understand how the law sees that and how you can defend yourself against that particular practice. So, for example, affirmative action, which is a concept which actually dates back to the Depression. And affirmative action back then meant hiring qualified minorities. Because as part of various unions, since we couldn't get into certain unions to work, and one of the qualifications for being in a union is you're actually qualified to do the work that the unions organize around to. Affirmative action in that time, in the Depression era, meant hiring qualified minorities, which meant they were already working or had already been working. And we see some of those memes in action today, except that now affirmative action is a code word for hiring unqualified minorities over a qualified white person. Or usually it's code for that. Oh, you got your job because of affirmative action. All right? There is I didn't bring my computer that has this music, but this is a Louis Armstrong tune, Black and Blue. Tunes like Brother Can You Spare a Dime and other songs try to cheer everyone up. Wrap your troubles in dreams. Life is just a bowl of cherries. This is a Black and Blue, old empty bed, springs hard as lead, feel like old Ned, that's the devil. Wish I was dead, what did I do to be so black and blue? Even a mouse ran from my house, they laugh at you and scorn you too. What did I do to be so black and blue? I'm white inside, but that don't help my case, 'cause I can't hide what is in my face. Of course, Satchmo does it better. How would it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue? For a 3-minute song, it's really great because half of it is like horn solo at the beginning.
It is.
Yeah, maybe I'll play it next week, but how will it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin.
One of the only ones who could get that high C.
Yeah, right. What did I do to be so black and blue? So there are a series of Depression era songs, and these basically tell the story of them. Don't know if you can find them on iTunes. Probably, but Brother, can you spare a dime? So, for example, plight of unemployed World War I veterans, thousands of whom were encamped in Washington, D.C. in the summer of '32 to lobby for payment of the bonus Congress had pledged they would get in 1945. The brutal routing via tank, saber, and tear gas of the so-called bonus army on the night of July 28th by forces commanded by Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur aroused public sympathy and inspired Yarburg's bitter lyric about bread lines and a once proud soldier reduced to begging. So you remember those nursery rhymes I talked about? Okay, so if you don't know the historical context behind these songs, so imagine what would be if we translated this to 21st century terms. Gulf War and Iraq War vets stage a sit-in on the National Mall to protest. Except in this time, a famous general breaks him up with tear gas and bayonets and stuff. Tank, saber, and tear gas. So they're rolling tanks on war veterans in D.C.
To build a city.
Yeah. Okay. So when Martin Luther King is talking about, we need to build, let's see, what it's like a tent city, a poverty village, to basically protest the war on poverty, etc. Before he's killed, or after the March on Washington, and actually they tried to organize, that kind of protest. Basically, there's a historical precedent behind that. So when I'm talking about solutions, before they take your rights away to publicly assemble. So understand the people that we have actually had and supposedly given respect to, if we're not taking care of them and treating them well and they protest, how do we respond to that? Louis Armstrong, All of Me, scarcely suggests the desperation of many Americans. He recorded this then new standard during the Depression's bleakest winter. National income had declined by 50% since 1929. 14 million Americans were unemployed at the outset of 32. Americans were giving their all that winter just to survive. Legions of homeless scavenged for scraps and huddled in shanty towns dubbed Hoovervilles after the president who said, "What this country needs is a good big laugh." Secretly, Hoover urged not to cut Army and Navy pay, as well-fed troops might soon be needed to quell a revolution at home. Now, you may know, because of posse comitatus, that U.S. military is not supposed to be used to quell revolutions at home.
Well, the reason that whole thing started is they didn't get their bonus from coming back from World War I.
Right. Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. I've often thought about how I'd incorporate music into this. But Henry Ford's Old-Fashioned Dance Orchestra. Henry Ford's ironic role as patron of the folk arts. He had a 19th century rural sensibility, even as assembly lines and Model Ts pushed America into the 20th century. There is a term called Disruptive innovation. And part of what disruptive innovation is, actually, you can look it up, you can Google the term. So it's not the automobile, it is the mass manufacturing of automobiles, which then basically causes the country to shift and organize around this new form of transportation. Because the brothers Chevrolet, among others, had basically created cars before Henry Ford. All Henry Ford did was create a way of mass producing them cheaply. Assembly line, right. And it's the assembly line technology that is the disruptive innovation. Because then, now what do we do with all these cars? Because many times the cars didn't have roads. Think of America without cars today. Now, I'm from Los Angeles, that's pretty much inconceivable. Nobody walks in LA, right? The song from the 80s. Right, that's true. Nobody walks in LA. So, yeah, look at this extensive, not only oil industry, so oil isn't just for gasoline, everything that you've got that's made of plastic. Your roads, everything, toothbrushes, all that stuff. It's made of plastic. Your CDs, okay, you download, but your computers, right? All that is dependent on oil. We're addicted to oil. That's a disruptive technology too. So, Detroit Moon. Mean Low Blues, Blues Bird Head, James Simon. So, evoking the rural South and the dislocation felt by many who left it for northern cities in the Great Migration, Blues Bird Head waxed Mean Low Blues in Richmond, Virginia, before the Depression. Waxed. This is when records, were made by wax impressions and then plastic. Basically, then made the impression. So, whether the obscure harp player's fortunes would have been improved had he joined the 1930s flood of New York-bound migrants is another matter. 1 out of every resident of New York, every 20 residents of New York is a Negro, wrote Adam Clayton Powell, 1935. There are about 300,000 black, brown, and yellow folk. 1/2 are not working, the other half is existing on crumbs from the table. There's a new day coming. Ted Lewis and his band. This peppy ode to full employment put a bright face even as the banking system was collapsing. No matter, Ted Lewis, the top-hatted tragedian of jazz, foresaw full employment for the brewer, and on March 13th, the new president asked Congress to legalize beer. The repeal of Prohibition became official December of 1933. Born Theodore Freeman in 1892, Ted Lewis blew a corny clarinet and billed himself the medicine man of the blues. His career spanned vaudeville to Vegas, and his slogan, "Is everybody happy?" never changed. Lewis aimed to please. Gloomy Sunday by Lady Day, Miss Billie Holiday. So, popular folklore of the Great Depression has Wall Street pedestrians dodging a hailstorm of failed financiers jumping from skyscrapers. Nothing like that ever happened, but America's suicide rate increased and its birth rate declined during the Depression. Edmund Wilson wrote movingly of the American earthquake of the unemployed man whose last desperate act was rationalized in the coroner's report due to ill health, family troubles, and no work. Given that background, it may be understandable that Holiday's recording of Gloomy Sunday was reportedly banned from radio. The suicidal reverie was written in Hungary in 1933 and first recorded in English by Paul Robeson in 1940. Legend has it that Gloomy Sunday, or Sozumuro Vasarunapp, as it was known in Hungary, inspired suicides wherever it was heard, hence its name, the Suicide Song. Day after tomorrow, there will be a play here, and also Sunday, of Dr. Stanley Coleman, who teaches here. He's going to be playing the lead role in the one act. I think it's a one act, but one-man play about Paul Robeson. So I suggest you check it out. Only $5 for students, and you can contribute. You can pay more, and all proceeds will go to the BSU Scholarship Fund. So Friday, 7:30. I think Sunday in the afternoon. Heading for better times. So I'm going to skip through these. Are you making any money? Whistle while you work, etc. So here's some figures for you that come during this time. Percy Julian, A. Philip Randolph, W.F. Fard, Elijah Muhammad, Union Bank, the rise of Hitler, connection of Hitler to Ford, Walker, Bush, the Olympics, and the run-up to World War II. So, Percy Julian, and the stupid PC is not showing the picture, which hopefully you'll be able to read this when I put it up in Moodle. No, you can't. What if this is what you were told when you tried to pursue your dreams, your interests, your goals? Would you become more determined? What if you ultimately succeeded, became rich, received all kinds of awards, and even had a postage stamp issued in your honor? If you did, then you'd be like African-American chemist Percy Levon Julian. How many of you ever taken cortisone? Percy Julian. He went to a segregated elementary school that didn't teach any science. He couldn't go to high school because there was no high school for African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. Instead, he went to the Alabama State Normal School. A school for blacks that taught practical skills like blacksmithing, hat making, and trained teachers for black schools. It too offered little or no science. So what if you have a hankering for science? Where do you get it? He read about science in his father's library at home, and chemistry fascinated him. He soon decided he wanted to be a chemist. His father wanted him to be a doctor. Okay. Back then, because of segregation, there's a need for black doctors who would treat black patients, but the only jobs in chemistry were in white-owned factories and laboratories. His father warned him about how hard it would be for him to find a job as a chemist, but young Percy was highly motivated, became even more determined when he heard about an African-American named St. Elmo Brady, who had recently graduated from the University of Illinois with a PhD in chemistry. He convinced his father that he could achieve his goal in 1916 with the help of a teacher named Joan Stewart. At the normal school, he entered DePauw University in Indiana to study chemistry. Since he attended a normal school, that's quotes, that's how the computer program translated the quotes, a normal school and not a regular high school, when he entered DePauw, he was required to take special courses for 2 years to make up for what he would have learned in a regular high school, that is a white high school. Only when he finished those would he start taking freshman college classes. Didn't have it easy in college. He lived in the attic of a fraternity house, worked as a waiter in the fraternity's dining room to pay the rent, and he also made money digging ditches. There not being Pell Grants then. Became a professor of chemistry in 26 at West Virginia Collegiate Institute, now West Virginia State University. For 2 years, he was the only member of the chemistry department at this all-black institution. Lab didn't have much equipment, which was typical of black colleges at the time, and also many colleges for whites in West Virginia, relatively poor state. He played a role in getting West Virginia State's accreditation, which meant it had offered an education equal to that of neighboring white colleges. Despite the equipment limitations, he started doing research in organic chemistry. When he was not teaching, he began to recreate the experiments of famous Austrian chemist Ernest Splaff. Why did it do that, I wonder? Splaff had basically made or synthesized naturally occurring chemical compounds in the laboratory, and Percy Julian was interested in the compounds found in plants, began synthesizing plant compounds like nicotine and ephedrine. So, cold remedies, ephedrine. After 2 years at West Virginia, he was ready to move on. He moved to D.C., become chair of the organic chemistry department at Howard, replacing St. Elmo Brady, the man who first inspired him, and was still one of the most important and respected. So Howard was, of course, is still one of the most respected historically black colleges in the U.S. He designed a new chemistry lab at Howard, cost more than $1 million, something he couldn't have done at West Virginia. So he went back to school, got his PhD, went to Austria to study under Spaff, the man whose experiments he tried to duplicate. Returned to the States and synthesized physostigmine, which I forget which drug that is, but he's working on chemicals in plants. It's found in calabar beans, poisonous beans that grow in West Africa. Physostigmine was an effective treatment for glaucoma, but natural physostigmine was expensive, so he basically learned how to synthesize that in the lab. So that kind of drugs from soybeans, etc. So a lot of people, Percy Julian, like I said, was a postage stamp, or is a postage stamp. And let's see, paint, all kinds of stuff. Soy oil, protein, coatings for paper and latex, paints, oil for salad dressing, shortening, glues, plastics, numerous patents for soybean products while always at Glidden, the paint company. And Fisk University, Harvard. A. Philip Randolph. Asa Philip Randolph and his brother were superior students. They attended the Cookman Institute in East Jacksonville, Florida. For years, his only academic high school was for African Americans in Florida. And the reason I'm going through this is to understand that while once education was bifurcated by race and also gender, where you had differences in access to resources and resources allocated, that would persist even when schools became integrated. So part of the issue was not just simply integration, but it was also equal access, as well as not only just equal access, but equal funding levels. So if every school in LA Unified had the same access to resources that was in, for example, Beverly Hills High School, we'd have a different educational system with different outcomes. A. Philip Randolph and his brother, valedictorians, excelling in literature, drama, and public speaking, also baseball and singing. He worked odd jobs and devoted his time to singing, acting, and reading Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folks, which convinced him to fight for social equality. He moved to New York to become an actor, but gave up after failing to win his parents' approval. He married Ms. Green, a widow, Howard University graduate and entrepreneur who shared his socialist politics and earned enough money to support them both. They had no children. He helped organize the Shakespearean Society in Harlem and played the roles of Hamlet, Othello, and Romeo, among others. At the age of 21, he joined the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs. In response to increasing segregation and discrimination against blacks, he shunned moderate reform and racial integration, as advocated by Du Bois, and emphasized instead socialism and trade unionism. That is, we form our own unions against racial discrimination. In 17, he founded and co-edited The Messenger, a radical monthly magazine, which campaigned against lynching, opposed U.S. participation in World War I, and urged African Americans to resist being drafted to fight for a segregated society, and recommend they join radical unions. He would later, and we'll talk about this when we get to the Second World War, be instrumental in the first March on Washington. Jesse Owens was an American track and field athlete. He participated in the 36 Summer Olympics in Berlin, where he achieved international fame by winning 4 gold medals, one each in the 100 meters, 200 meters, long jump, and as part of the 4x1 relays, he became the first American to win 4 Olympic gold medals in track and field. Yeah.
Nazis didn't like that when he did that in Berlin.
Now, a slight sidebar. This quote was basically, well, I'll just read it. The international narcotics industry is the largest growth industry in the world. Its annual revenues exceed $500 billion, 3 times the value of all U.S. currency in circulation. $1 million in gold weighs as much as a large man. $500 billion in gold weighs more than the entire population of Washington, D.C. Narcotics industry profits, secretly stockpiled around the world, draw interest exceeding $3 million per hour. The above statistics are based on information appearing in classified documents prepared by the CIA and NSA, and that's the 1985 figures. So the reason I placed this quote here is the international narcotics, well, actually it's now more than narcotics, but what we refer to as the underground empire has its roots in the Depression. And so by the time, 50 years later, 1985, it's big business. Way big business, and even bigger now, obviously, if that's where it was in 85. So part of what happens when you have a depression, and I want to bring this more current, the election process that first brought Barack Obama to power. During the debate, John Edwards elaborated on his vision of 2 Americas and showed empathy towards an important block of Democratic primary voters, talking about racial disparities. Came during a discussion whether subprime lenders were targeting the most economically vulnerable people. This would be an economic code word for minorities. He said he didn't know their motivations, but added, what they have done is targeted the lowest income, most vulnerable families. If you're African American in this country today, you are likely to have a net worth of about 10% of what white families have. This is not an accident. I mean, we can put our heads against the wall and pretend that the past never happened, pretend that we didn't live through decades of slavery, followed by decades of segregation, followed by decades of discrimination, which is still going on today. Wait, this is not Barack Obama saying this. It appears the former North Carolina senator was relying on figures from the U.S. Census Bureau. In 2000, the median net worth of a household headed by a non-Hispanic white adult was $79,000. The median net worth of a household run by a black adult was $7,500. The figure for Hispanic households was $9,700. These figures, based on a 2003 report, net worth is measured total value of a household's financial assets, such as bank accounts, property, and vehicles, minus the household's financial liabilities. Though the measurement is an oft-used indicator of financial health, it doesn't always tell the whole story, because the amount of income generated by a household's assets is a key factor in maintaining a desired standard of living. i.e., if your house is increasing in value, you can borrow against that value. However, if the market falls and your house is underwater, i.e., the value of it is worth less than the money that you're paying on it, you're in trouble. It no longer becomes an asset, it's a liability. Who decides what the value is? Market forces. Right? In fact, if there's one statistic that captures the persistence of racial inequality in the United States, it is net worth. If you want to know your net worth, okay? Add up everything you own, subtract from this figure your total amount of outstanding debt. When we do this for white minority households, incredible differences emerge. Overall, the typical white family enjoys a net worth that is more than 7 times that of its black counterparts. Now, if you want to understand, well, sociostructural violence, okay? If it's more than twice the disparity, there is a structure producing it. It's not random chance. 7 times is definitely that. So this is from The Nation. This inequity, which has grown in the decades since the civil rights triumphs of the 60s, cannot be explained by income differences alone. That is, while African Americans do earn less than whites, asset gaps remain large, even when we compare black and white families at the same income levels. For instance, at the lower end of the economic spectrum, incomes less than 15 grand a year, median African American family has a net worth of 0. While the equivalent white family's net worth is 10,000. Now, part of this started in the Great Depression, if not beyond, but the basic infrastructure that reinforces that started back in that time. And so to basically overcome this, because this causes suffering, you need to understand the causes of that suffering and do what you can to end it in your daily practices. Likewise, among the often heralded new black middle class, the typical white family earning $40,000 per year enjoys a nest egg of around $80,000. Its African American counterpart has less than half that amount. Among the wealthiest Americans, the story is the same. Oprah Winfrey and Robert Johnson, founder of Black Entertainment Television, are the only African Americans on the Forbes annual list of the 400 richest people in the United States, and they are both on the lower end of the list. Actually, that might have changed slightly, but essentially there may be 3 or 4 black billionaires. This racial wealth gap accounts for many of the racial differences in socioeconomic achievement that persisted in the post-civil rights era. When we compare black and white families who have the same income and net worth, we find African American kids are more likely to graduate from high school than whites and are just as likely to complete college. When we compare individuals who grew up in families with the same economic resources, income, and wealth, we find the wage gap between blacks and whites disappears, and African Americans are just as likely as Anglos to be working full time. So education does give you an advantage, but not just book learning. You also have to learn the hidden curriculum too. So, but among the poor, lack of assets makes blacks more likely to rely on welfare and other forms of public assistance, which actually teach you to reinforce the poverty, because they don't give you money.
What is 2x plus y?
You need to know. I knew your mathematical mind would do that. Okay. X equals I'll just say white privilege. So it's not just race. It's also the system that produces those inequities that we just talked about, right? So in order to be successful, you need to know 2x, twice x. So you need to understand the system of interlocking privileges that put this together, and you need to know 2x, twice that, plus y. That is why you need to succeed to be successful. That's the success formula. You need to know twice as much as your white hippie friends to be considered equal. That's my dad said. So the market crash. Just to explain that, we were talking about this the other day. Total market capitalization of all publicly traded companies in the world was $51 trillion in January 2007, rose as high as $57.5 trillion in May 2008 before dropping below $50 trillion in August 2008 and slightly above US $40 trillion. So this is basically the most recent crash that we dealt with, where we talked about, okay, the bubble. This is similar to the dot-com bubble. All right, well, 2 minutes, so good. I'll leave this up. This will be up. And we'll consider the 30s and 40s and final prep next week. So you can roll music.
Lane Online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.